Hello, dear friends. Today is the 30th of June, Monday, the day before the enemy made another massive barbaric attack on the settlements of Ukraine. This happened right after he announced that Russia was ready for another round of peaceful negotiations with Ukraine. It is obvious that the current ruler of the Kremlin, Putler, is strictly acting according to the decals of his spiritual predecessor, Hitler. However, as a bad student at school, he probably does not remember the lessons of history, which is that the country that first started the barbaric bombing of cities, on the other hand, usually ended badly. This concerns the spiritual mentor of Putler by the name of Hitler. By the way, the famous and influential analytical journal, The Atlantic, published recently an interesting article by a scientific worker of the Institute of American Entrepreneurship. This is a conservative scientific and analytical center that is close to the Republicans and close to the current administration. By the way, it is noted that Iran is an axis of evil. Iran, China, and Russia will collapse at the decisive moment. That is now. Why decisive? Because, well, I mean, there is a war in the Middle East with all the consequences. By the way, it is reported that Beijing loves its allies who are being teased by the United States of America, but stability for Beijing is the most important thing. And here it is noted that the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine was, one way or another, coordinated with Beijing and reflected its interests. Also, the activities of Iran in the Middle East also reflected the interests of Beijing. Recently, the first railway opened that connects China with Iran. As it is said in the article, after the first strike of Israel on June 13, Iraq, it was possible to expect that China, the strongest partner in this oasis of evil, would hasten to give Iran a missile of low range, equipment, anti-air defense, and so on. Even without this, without the supply of weapons, China could provide significant diplomatic assistance, calling for the Security Council, condemning the United States, organizing through its extensive ties to the countries of the Global South, organized such a massive condemnation of the United States, Israel, make a resolution of the Organization of White Nations condemning these countries. Absolutely nothing of this has been done. Because of this, the author makes an interesting and correct conclusion. The recent events in Iran showed that anti-Americanism, and this is the basis, the foundation of the evil axis, cannot strengthen the Union for a long time. After the ritual condemnation of the first blow to Israel as an impudence and violation of Iran's sovereignty, Beijing began to act very, very carefully. In a telephone conversation, the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Wang Yi, when he talked to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, he did not express any condemnation. He called for diplomatic regulation, caution, deterrence. Xi Jinping waited for 4 days, and then he called for de-escalation and said that China was ready to work with all sides to play a constructive role in restoring peace and stability in the Middle East. That is, in fact, as a strategic ally, Iran was abandoned, or one might say thrown away. And after the Iranians threatened to block the Armenian Strait, the official representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China emphasized, it looked like a warning to Iran, that the Persian Strait is the most important global trade route, and therefore it should not suffer. Global interests should not suffer because of local interests, meaning the war that Iran got into due to its nuclear developments. This is how Beijing's open position came about. Global interests, and this is global economy, China first of all, it is higher than the interests of some local Trifles, its satellites. Well, I must say that such a soft reaction of China is not only a blow to Iran. But it can also testify that such an advertised endless partnership between Xi Jinping and Putin may not be as strong as it is, first of all, in Moscow. That is, it may just be a breath of fresh air and empty words when the speech comes in, when it really smells of fried and when on the map or significantly touched by the strategic interests of Beijing. It turns out that for Beijing, these small satellites where Russia, South, North Korea, and Iran enter are just tools to tease the United States of America a little and break the balance in foreign policy of the United States. To use it somehow but no more, and this is despite the fact that, as you know, China, about 80 to 90% of the export of Iranian oil goes to China. That is, this is extremely important for Iran. But this is not so important for China because this oil and its import is only 10%. Well, the economy of China, as the author writes, is more than 40 times more than the economy of Iran. And for him, cooperation with the United States and the European Union is much more important. And the same applies to Russia. The same, as the author of the article believes, if the Kremlin starts running out of money or soldiers on the battlefields of Ukraine, then China's readiness to help its ally raises great doubts, because in the export of Russian oil, gas, and other materials that is for Russia this activity is vital, and for China this is a drop in the ocean. Moreover, the author emphasizes that in this axis there are deep ideological contradictions. Oddly enough, all this is mixed, all this evil is exclusively on anti-Americanism. But as for ideology, which should, in theory, be the foundation of any strong, long-term alliance, the situation is bad there. Xi Jinping recently in a public speech proclaimed the importance of the Great October Socialist Revolution of 1917, which inspired ideas in a wide mass of Chinese people who have opened a new path of development for China, which is still being guided in the face of the Communist Party of China. At this time, Putin already says that this is a tragic fate in the history of Russia, which knocked it off the rails and all that stuff. As for the relations between these two countries and Iran, there is also a deep contradiction, because Iran has everything mixed up with religion, with a desire not just Islam, but a certain specific branch of this Islam. And this in no way coincides with worldview, with ideological priorities, neither Moscow nor Beijing. And here is an interesting thought in this article. Beijing's reaction to the situation with Iran can cause careful optimism in the West. If Donald Trump finally learns to distinguish the aggressor from the victim, this is a hint about Russia and Ukraine. Or at least understand that Putin is playing with him, the President of the United States can provide Ukraine with serious support without worrying about the expansion of Russia's aid from China. Until Iran and Russia continue to supply cheap oil to the West and its allies, they serve the purpose of China. But at least at the moment, Beijing is unlikely to support any of its alleged partners if they put China's interests and stability at risk, or its extensive and profitable relations with the West. In other words, if Putin believes that he is reliably covered, he is in the illusory world. The only thing that is necessary, the only problem now from the point of view of Ukraine and its allies, Europe as a whole, is the strange attitude or perception of Putin as a state figure, and the personality of the President of the United States, Trump. Well, we will talk about this further. By the way, today a very important event took place regarding Trump. I will now tell you about the convo which took place during the NATO session and what concerns directly Ukraine. So today the agency reports Iran's high-ranking spiritual leader took out Fatwa or Fathu, I don't know, it is translated into Russian in different ways, saying that anyone who threatens the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, is the enemy of God. The fatwa was brought out by the great Ayatollah Shirazi, answering questions about the threats from Trump and the leaders of Israel, including Prime Minister Netanyahu. Let me remind you that the fatwa is a resolution on how to interpret the Islamic law, and this fatwa gives some kind of high spiritual authority. According to the fatwa, all Muslims in the world must make these enemies Trump and Netanyahu. There are also a number of Israeli leaders. The main ones are Trump and Netanyahu. So all Muslims in the world must make these enemies regret their words and mistakes. The state media of Iran, where it is said, says that the fatwa was signed and sealed with seals in response to the Estefta, that is, the official request. And it is of great importance because Trump is directly mentioned in it, and here is the sensation. It was widely spread in the media that Ayatollah Khamenei at one time issued a fatwa that allegedly prohibits the manufacture of nuclear weapons in Iran, like God forbid it, so I forbid it. From this, Tulsi Gabbard, if you remember, in March of this year, said that Iran is not engaged in this matter, and two arguments were brought to us. Why? Well, one argument is that American intelligence did not see the real steps on the way to the implementation of this program of the creation of a nuclear bomb. And the second is that there is a fatwa, how to get over it. But in this fatwa, in this explanation, which was voiced in Iranian media, in this new fatwa against Netanyahu and Trump, it is said that this has great significance. And that unlike the non-existent fatwa that prohibits the creation of nuclear weapons, this fatwa is real. That is, according to this report, the fatwa of Khamenei about prohibiting the production of nuclear weapons simply does not exist. And this is a very interesting turn of events, which may have great consequences. Israel reports that the Court of Israel, which dealt with the Netanyahu case, the case of corruption, decided not to hold another hearing. And why did this happen? But I don't know, I didn't read what motivated the court to make this decision, because I recently listened to an interview of one of the ministers of the Israeli cabinet, who was one of the 15 highest officials of the state, who took part in the decision to strike on Iran. So he said that during this whole time, the planning of such an event, then the strike. Almost 2-3 times a week, every week, Netanyahu was called to interrogation. He was interrogated. They were filming evidence on this criminal case, which in itself is, of course, a nightmare from the point of view of common sense. So this is the first reason why the court was able to finally make a decision that it was necessary to go down the path of common sense. And the second option, recently a friend of Doni decided to help his friend Bibi, and on his page he wrote a devastating appeal to the authorities of Israel. Are you out of your mind? Netanyahu is a war hero. We went through. Hell with him, taking part in the planning of a strike on the liquidation of Iran's nuclear program. Therefore, we must not be in a hurry. We must close all these investigations because there is nothing to investigate and judge. There is nothing to investigate and judge. That is, Donnie has decided, he, like Ayatollah, has made a wise decision that his friend Netanyahu, since he is a hero of the war, cannot be a corrupter, and this matter must be ended. And here is the American publication Axios, in which one of the most well-informed Israeli journalists in the United States works, writes, another statement was made, that is, this very statement of Dawn was widely used in Israel as an attempt to use U.S. military aid to put pressure on Israel to cancel the judicial process. That is, it was really all put into words. Trump gave instructions to the judicial bodies of Israel what they should do and how they should act. Otherwise, he would turn to the help of Israel. The author, by the way, recalls that for decades the help of the United States and Israel was something sacred in America for any party that was in power. There were no debates about this, and to put it in dependence on some whims, it didn't even come to. Anyone in the worst dream, and so it happened. But here we must also keep in mind. It turns out that yesterday a number of revelations were voiced by Senator Graham. Apparently, he organized these leaks to show their importance, influence on the president. Next, we will go through some of them, but one thing about this issue. It turned out that it was Graham who suggested to Trump the idea about the purpose of directly entering America into this war of Israel and Iran. And it was based on the fact that I suggested on the very first day of this war, in my very first video on this issue. So Graham said to Trump, look at how well Israel is fighting, what great successes. We need to understand something from this from you, Mr. President, in terms of PR. Therefore, it is necessary to join. It is necessary, as the proverb says, to jump into a train or a car in which a jazz band or a cheerful orchestra is driving, and thus to get your share of fame. Well, it must be said that there are growing doubts in the United States about the usefulness and purposefulness of this step. And at the moment, there are only two people who publicly said that it was successful for Trump. This is Trump himself and his defense minister. Now it turns out that all this happened to them according to Graham's recommendations. But I have a big doubt that this can be useful and good for Graham himself. His election campaign is in danger. There were recently elections in South Carolina in local authorities, and one of the districts in which the Democrats never won, and suddenly there won a 24-year-old boy, without any experience, without any background on the basis of what he did nothing in his life on the basis of what he could have been elected. So he was probably elected because he was not a Republican, and there, too, Graham will be re-elected. Let's see how it all ends for him. Nevertheless, on Sunday, he announced in an ABC interview that Trump gave the order to adopt a bill on sanctions. That is the very bill which has long been, in short, half suspecting. With the hope of raising its renommee, Graham said.
рассказывал Грэм.
According to those leaks that were mainly from Graham, the idea is to declare, by this law, in the event of
Идея
adoption.
состоит в том, чтобы объявить этим законом в случае принятия
The introduction of 500% tariffs against countries that, on the one hand, buy various goods from the Russian Federation, and on the other hand, do not help
у Российской
Ukraine.
Федерации, а с другой стороны не помогают Украине.
Well, it is clear that
Понятно,
China
что
and
главное
India are
решение
potentially the main
потенциально
targets.
Китай и Индия.
And by and large, if there were no other
И по большому
entourage that we are talking
если
about
бы
now,
не было
then,
вот
in
всего
principle,
остального
this is a
антуража,
good
то
idea,
есть
this
второй
is a good
федерации,
bill.
то в принципе это хорошая идея, это хороший
But I
законопроект.
have a very
Но
significant doubt that
у
Trump
меня
will ever dare to introduce
есть
a
очень
500%
существенные
tariff
сомнения
against
в том,
China.
что Трамп когда-нибудь осмелится ввести 500% тариф против
He
Китая.
recently, you remember,
Он недавно,
introduced
вы помните, вводил
145% and barely got out of
и
there.
еле оттуда выпутался.
It is not yet
Еще
known whether
неизвестно,
he is
совсем ли
completely
выпутался.
confused. It turned out that
Казалось, что
China is
Китай
very
очень
simple
просто
to keep him on the hook only through, at least
только
through,
хотя бы
rare land
через
metals.
редкоземельные металлы.
It's
Проще
simpler than
простого.
simple. Trump is doing well, China
Хорошо
is letting
ведет себя
in,
Трамп,
and then in
Китай
limited
отпускает
quantities
и
of
тоже
rare
в
land
больших
metals.
количествах редкоземельные металлы.
A little bit
Чуть что
wrong,
не так,
everything is
забьем
prohibited.
всё.
The entire military
Вся война
industry of the
закончится
United
результатом.
States and the
И
automotive
автомобильная
industry are
промышленность
under
находится
threat.
под угрозой.
The same
Ну,
goes
это
for
очень другое
India.
дело.
The United
Это
States views
показывает
India as a growing economy, one of the
растущую
leading
экономику
economies in the
по
world,
отношению
not
к
to mention the
миру,
third
говоря
world.
уже о третьем мире.
So much money was
Столько
spent to
сил и
tear it
средств
off from the
было
traditional
потрачено, чтобы
ties with
оторвать ее
Moscow,
от
and suddenly
традиционных связей с
500%,
Москвой.
it's just
И вдруг
incredible, just
500%,
incredible.
ну, это просто невероятно, просто невероятно. А,
Well, and then if, let's
Но
say,
и
it was
затем,
possible to
если,
imagine that Trump,
допустим, можно было представить, что у Трампа есть
had a
серьезная
serious geostrategic idea to go to
идея
Russia, to Putin, to the
геостратегическая
Kremlin.
влиять на
Well,
Рашу,
and then
на
it was
Путина, на
possible,
Кремль.
damn it, with
Ну, или
India,
там
we
можно
sacrifice
всё
China,
с Индией
somehow we deal
пожертвовать,
with them,
Китаем,
we
как-нибудь там
introduce.
с ними справимся, вводим.
But this is
Но
not
это
happening. If someone
не
still does
происходит.
not guess, I will
Если
tell you
все еще
that
не
Trump has no
догадываются, то я вам
strategy,
скажу,
no
что
geopolitics,
с
and he company
геостратегией,
himself with
геополитикой
external.
Трампа никак. И компанию он себя советников по внешнеполитическому
Advisors on foreign policy
кругу
issues in the power bloc in general, he chose no foreign policy.
Есть там один толковый
There
человек,
is one
считаю,
sensible
это
person, I
Рубио.
think this is
Он
Rubio,
flugger.
but he
Он
is a
flugger.
flugger,
Он
he
имеет
is a
точку
flugger.
зрения,
He
имеет
does not have his
позицию.
own point of view, and in the
Ставит
end
на
he will be
сторону
on the side of the
Израиля,
president,
какой бы
no matter how
безумной
crazy
эта
this
идея
idea
ни
was.
была. Поэтому фактически
Therefore, there are
команда
practically
Немцева
no
самый главный
commands, he himself
специалист.
is not a
А
specialist.
самое
And most
главное,
importantly,
стержень,
the
так
core, so
сказать,
to speak,
внешней
of Trump's
политики
foreign
и
policy and
стратегии Трампа — это
geostrategies is the
гешефтная
guise of
дипломатия, как
diplomacy,
я
which
уже
I have
говорил.
already told you.
И
And
как
as
я
I
недавно
recently
прочитал,
read, an American
американский
analyst wrote,
аналитик
it
написал,
seems that Trump's foreign policy is
что
aimed
внешняя
at making the
политика
Trump family
Трампа
the
нацелена на то, чтобы сделать семейство Трампа самым богатым
richest
семейством
family in the
в
United
США.
States and make him the
Кстати,
first
ждем
trillionaire.
его
Well,
первого
and most of all, Trump's biggest foreign
триллионера,
policy
так сказать.
actions, they kind of
Ну
lead
и
to
по
these
большому
thoughts.
счету крупнейшие внешнеполитические акции Трампа, они как-то так наводят на эти размышления.
So I will tell you that
Я вам
my
скажу,
own
что
assessment from the point
моя
of view of
собственная оценка
Trump's
с точки
strategy
зрения
towards Putin
стратегии
is a
Трампа в
guillotine
отношении Путина
diplomacy.
— это гешефтная
That
дипломатия.
is, Trump has
Трамп
already
уже
cut
создал
off to some
такой
extent,
системе.
well, so
Ну, пока
far, a
такой
passing
проходящий,
guillotine from Ukraine in the form of minerals.
перспективный гешефт с Украиной в виде минералов.
He has already used
Он
Saudi
пользуется там
Arabia,
уже
the
на
Emirates,
Ближнем
Qatar in the
Востоке,
Middle East.
Саудовской Аравией, Эмиратами, Катаром.
But with
А вот с
Putin, he
Путиным
often
он
breaks his
все иногда у
ideas
него часто
spontaneously. We
прорывается
will
у
do the
него
largest investment projects
идеи
together with
спонтанно
Putin.
так вот мы будем крупнейшие инвестиционные проекты делать вместе с Путиным. Ну,
Well,
давайте
let's talk
поговорим.
further. We will guess with
Догадываетесь
you
с
what
вами,
kind of
что это
projects
за
it is.
проект?
This is a
Это проект,
project
о
that
котором
one of its
один из
participants, the
участников
operator,
оператора
says that
говорит,
whoever
кто
sits
на
on
нем
it will
сядет,
become the
станет
richest
богатейшим
person in the
человеком в
world.
мире.
Until
До тех
then,
пор,
oil and
пока
gas will be
будут
used in
пользоваться спросом
demand.
нефть и газ.
So cheap plans apparently were promised to him. Vitkov also went there. It was not in vain. He became the main. He became Henry Kissinger of our days, Trump's business partner.
Деловой партнер Трампа.
But in
Но для
order
того,
to
чтобы
enter into these
вступить
business
в эти
relations with
гешефтные
Putin,
отношения
it
с
is
Путиным,
necessary to
надо
somehow end,
как-то
as they
закончить,
say, the conflict in
как-то
Ukraine.
закончить, как они говорят, конфликт в Украине.
And the conflict must be ended for Trump in such a way that it does not strike with terrible force on his rating and on the rating of the entire Republican Party. These two ratings are connected inextricably. Here, somehow something needs to be done, sit down, wipe out Putin so that he would step down a little bit, and then bam, and that's it, and the Gashaf went. Well, for the Gashaf, Trump does not need Putin at all. That is, he has a lot of his options. He is already gashed. He is probably already the richest person in the world. That is, somehow his partners are getting rich. Putin does not need, in the most critical way, Trump in this case. On the other hand, how to finish, what concessions? He does not know what concessions he can make. Because, well, a successful offensive breaks out. There, at halftime, all this is told in a whisper that allegedly this is a successful offensive. And suddenly, bang, to leave some territories. In general, a completely incomprehensible situation for Putin. This one breaks out into a gorge, and from the side of Moscow, well, let's pull it up a little more. Maybe we'll take some kind of hut or something like that. A little bit more, we'll get somewhere there, we'll box, we'll put 10,000 people there, but still 500 meters ahead. So apparently Trump needs to get rid of Putin, get him out of this blind corner, and before that, he needs an option that is comfortable. For Trump in Ukraine, and for this, apparently, he will give a command to Graham to push this bill through the Senate. As expected, it will begin after Independence Day, that is, after July 4. Thus, I am completely convinced that initially this bill was planned as an option to force. That is, he had to keep the obligation of the president to do what is written in this law. The latter, in fact, Graham did not talk about this in this interview with the ABC TV company, but the day before it was clear and he admitted that this bill gives us the discretionary powers of the president, that is, whether he wants to use it or not, whether he wants to use it or not. Well, yes, to tickle Putin's ear a little bit so that he would shudder, but no more, no more. Therefore, I have no special hopes for this bill, for its effectiveness. Meanwhile, the European Union understands this, the main strategy of Trump in relation to Putin. One of the main cheap events there is the creation of a joint project between Russia and the United States. A person who is already working on it, a person who is close to the business interests of Trump, his last name, if I'm not mistaken, is Lynch. How to use the Northern Stream to let Russian gas into Europe. That is, 3 years, Europe cuts itself off from this bear's corner from. This Orchistan, and now Trump will drive Russian gas back into Europe. But in order not to let this happen, in the 18th package of sanctions of the European Union, a ban on any organization, business, all citizens to participate in this business project, that is, it completely kills any business associated with this northern flow. The 18th package was supposed to be adopted, in my opinion, last week. It was failed to a large extent thanks to Hungary. And this is apparently the lever with which Trump is trying not to let go, because it kills the cheap, the most important. Cheap Trump project that he can have with Putin. And right after the 18th package was failed, the United States removed the sanctions from the business project in which the Russian Rosatom participates, and I don't remember the name of the Hungarian company. This is, so to speak, a reward. Now the European Union is determinedly intending to accept this 18th package. Let's see what happens next. Because Hungary has already received the reward for the break in the previous attempt. What will happen next? What will Slovakia do? Maybe they will also reward it in some way. In short, the European Union is really good at this issue.
Они действительно молодцы в этом вопросе, потому что
because they are
они
trying to kill the
убивают
most corrupt project that
самый
may arise
кишерный
between Trump
или
and Putin.
пытаются убить самый коррупционный проект, который может возникнуть между Трампом и Путиным.
They are throwing a
Они
challenge
бросают
to
тем
Trump.
самым вызов Трампу. Они не просто щекочут ему нервы, они могут привести его в бешенство. Это несмотря на то, что они из кожи лезут вон, чтобы избежать такого развития ситуации, когда речь заходит о НАТО, о Евросоюзе, о экономических отношениях
The
между
fact that they are trying to
Евросоюзом
avoid
и
such a situation when it comes to NATO, the EU, the economic relations between the EU and the United States of America. In short, this is a very bold step, I would even say bold on the part of the European Union, taking into account how they treat Trump on other platforms. What else is important? Yes, we are following the fate of this package of the 18th. It is very necessary, and it is precisely with this ban, because this ban cuts off the most corrupt project that the Trump administration can have with Moscow, and this is a chance to steer the case in the right direction, so to speak, in the right direction. What else happened that is important, on the background of which we can look at the results of the last session of the NATO for Ukraine? Yesterday, there were messages that the general director of Magate, Grossi, said that the location of uranium, 60% uranium, is unknown. As it is not known the location of a significant part of the centrifuge. In general, Magate has some moment, and this happened, in my opinion, in May. They realized that they were violated the continuity of information about how much centrifuge and in which Iran's objects are located. And based on this, it is almost impossible to predict with a high degree of certainty what will happen next. So, thinking well and apparently discussing with his experts, Grossi reported that the location of 60% of this uranium is unknown. The location of a significant part of the centrifuge is also unknown. As it became known from other sources, they say that 170 centrifuges is enough to renew the enrichment of uranium, and at a fairly fast pace. And based on this report, it turns out that Iran, according to Grossi, can renew its nuclear program in a few months. This is the first question and not the most acute, not the most important one now. And the second is how soon it can create an atomic bomb with the uranium of 60%, which is allegedly gone. It turns out that this can be done faster. If there are several months, then here are 2, maybe 3 months. I will draw your attention because I am being written by people from different cities, like, someone said something here and someone said something there. They call it a respected organization, like Massid said. Remember one very important thing: if you want, write it down. There are no organizations in the world that are more authoritative in terms of the state of Iranian nuclear program than Magate. Why? Because only representatives of this organization can and could be more correct to the last moment, visit Iran's facilities and personally see what is happening there. All the rest of world intelligence, including CIRU, MI6, Chinese intelligence, Mossad, and even the glorious intelligence of Vinay and Bissau, they were only circling around Magate. What could they find out from agent sources if they have them there, although they are unlikely to have them there? And that's it. This is almost the truth in the last instance, although the truth absolutely does not exist. It is relative, of course, but nevertheless, of all relative truths, this is the most absolute. Well, and finally, the American intelligence has intercepted the conversation. This probably was done by the National Security Agency, two high-ranking military of Iran, and in this conversation. It is recorded that the damage from the blows that the nuclear objects of Iran experienced was not as strong as they feared. From the latest information that is now being leaked by the media, the assumption is growing that, and there is hope that this uranium
предположение, скажу так, что и есть надежда, что этот уран и эти
and these centrifuges are still in the territory of Iran. Well, first of all, the Isfahan was moved there for a reason much
ну, во-первых, Исфакан не зря туда переместили. Он гораздо
deeper,
глубже,
much deeper than the
значительно глубже,
Fordo,
чем
and they didn't even
Фордо.
try to bomb it,
Даже не
as you
пытались
know.
бомбить, как вы знаете.
In addition, now they say the information comes from the Magate that there are no less than 10 secret sources of places created by
Секретных источников, мест, созданных
Israel,
Израилем,
Iran, where the nuclear
продолжалось,
program continues
продолжается
and
и
will
будет
continue.
продолжаться
So,
ядерная
in connection with
война.
this, I wanted to report the
Вот,
results
собственно
of the
говоря, в
NATO
связи с
summit.
этим я вам и хотел доложить итоги саммита НАТО.
Analyzing the information currently available, the Foreign Policy newspaper writes that Iranian officials have already
Издание
stated
Foreign
that they
Policy пишет, что иранские официальные лица уже заявили, что
will
прекратят
stop
делиться
sharing certain
определенной
information
информацией
with
с Магатом.
Magate. This means that the situation will become worse than it was before the attack on Iranian nuclear facilities, because then Magate could still have some access.
Мог иметь какой-то доступ.
But if it stops having access, then that's it, then there is no way to get into the dungeon, and the Iranian nuclear program is completely out of control.
Полностью выходит из-под контроля.
And
И
apparently the
судя по
anxious
всему,
leaders of Iran took the course on this. And in this regard, as Foreign Policy writes, this makes smart
И в этой связи, как пишет Foreign Policy, это делает умелую дипломатию
diplomacy from the West even more important. Darby Menton, a member of the Program on Nuclear Policy at the Forum for Carnegie for the International Peace, says about this in particular. The expert warns that without certainty and transparency from both sides, Iran is at risk of becoming another Iraq. That is, this is serious and for a long time with very severe consequences for the entire region. Here, gentlemen, is such a situation. And here, against the background of all this, the NATO summit session took place. What do I want to tell them about this issue? You probably noticed in the media, in the broadest possible way, all these kind words are being discussed. Lies that were poured in the direction of Trump, how he was being deceived there, the impression that this was the strategic goal of this NATO meeting. That is, on the whole, a strategic landmark was taken down in that event, in this summit that took place.
Стратегический ориентир в том мероприятии, в этом саммите, который имел место.
Because with the presidency of Trump on the whole to this day, from my point of view, NATO has actually turned into a purely European structure plus Canada. The United States, in fact, well, they are still there formally, but in fact they cannot be counted on. It is impossible to rely on them on a difficult critical moment, and this is exactly why NATO was created. The fifth article, it flies into the trash can until the President of the United States is Trump. According to the fifth article, if the NATO country is under attack, other NATO countries must immediately gather for an urgent meeting and make a decision on the scale to which it will contribute to the joint response to the aggressor who attacked one of the members of the organization. Well, observing the evolution of Trump's policy, 150 days since he has been in power, I am almost sure that if, God forbid, some NATO country on the eastern flank attacks Russia, the first thing Trump will do is not pick up the phone in order to contact his NATO colleagues. First, he will call Putin and will deal with what he considers to be a naive specialist. He will discuss the deal.
он будет обсуждать deal.
While he will
Trump
discuss the
будет
deal,
обсуждать
Putin's
технические
troops will
войска
move on and
и
on.
дальше, и дальше.
In short, Trump will meet with the
Короче
aggressor,
говоря,
not with NATO
Трамп будет
colleagues.
совещаться с агрессором, а не с коллегами по НАТО.
And imagine that Trump
И
will raise the Pentagon,
представить
form
себе,
this air
что
bridge.
Трамп поднимет Пентагон, образует вот этот воздушный мост,
As it was planned for
который
decades according to the Reforger, and will send all this power to the United States to resist the enemy.
и направит все это, мощь Соединенных Штатов Америки на отпор врагу. Все это
All this
просто,
is just an
просто
illusion. That is, there
иллюзия.
is some kind
То
of
есть
game going
происходит
on.
какая-то
European
игра.
leaders perfectly
Европейские
understand that
лидеры
there
все
is
это
almost
прекрасно
no hope for
понимают,
Trump.
что надежды на Трампа практически никакой. Но они
But they play
играют
the
в игру.
game. They convince him
Они
that they
его
believe that he is still
убеждают
with them.
в том, что они верят в том, что он еще с ними. И
And
больше
most of
всего они
all, they are
опасаются
afraid of some idiotic
идиотской
way out,
версии,
that
что
he will be caught up
что-то
in
он
something. He will
за
find a
что-то
reason to
уцепится,
display some
специально найдет повод для того, чтобы изобразить какой-то
kind of
гнев
anger and slam the
и в
door
этом
and leave the
гневе и
NATO meeting
покинуть заседание
prematurely. That's how he did it. Well, he didn't really
преждевременно. Вот
slam
так
the
он
door there, but
сделал. Ну, там, правда, он особо дверью не хлопал, но тем не менее. Я имею в виду
nevertheless, I mean the last
встречу
meeting of G7. That is, the strategy of the Europeans until now, including the NATO.
До настоящего времени, включая саммит НАТО, состоял в
Summit
том,
was to prevent
чтобы
the
не
scandalous
допустить
exit of Trump from
скандального
NATO.
выхода Трампа
This is the
из
main
НАТО.
goal of this
Вот это главная
historical, as it
цель
was
этого
called, summit.
исторического, как его называли, саммита.
The
Европейцы
Europeans made a
сделали
bet not to allow a scandalous
ставку на то,
exit in
чтобы
the
замять разногласия смертельные в альянсе, не допустить скандального выхода, из-за чего Трамп
alliance which Trump will then
станет
cling to and will
напрямую
directly turn
развернется
to
к
Putin.
Путину. Вот это самое
This is the most
страшное.
terrible thing to
Единственное то,
avoid, in the
что
hope that when
когда
his term
закончится его
ends,
срок,
or the terrible ratings
они
after November
ужаснее
next
после
year,
ноября следующего года рейтинги, а это
it will
реально,
really fall so
упадут
much that the
настолько,
situation
что
will change in some
ситуация
way.
коренным
Here,
образом
on this
изменится.
background, in such
Вот
conditions, from my
на таком
point of
фоне,
view,
значит,
this NATO
в таких
summit took
условиях, с моей
place.
точки зрения, произошел этот саммит НАТО.
But it must
Надо
be
сказать,
said that for
что для
Ukraine,
Украины
despite
действительно
everything, this
хорошо.
development of events
Вот
is,
это
by
развитие
and large,
событий, по большому
favorable.
счету,
There are difficulties, as they
благоприятно.
say, but strategically
Есть
favorable.
сложности, как говорится, но стратегически благоприятно.
And
Итак,
so, why do I think it is
почему
favorable?
я считаю
Because
это
the
правильно? Потому
independence
что
of the
растет
European wing of
самостоятельность
NATO is
европейского
growing.
крыла НАТО.
It's time, the swamp
Давно
that
пора,
exists now in
что
Washington
болото,
in
которое
relation to
существует сейчас
Putin,
в
in
Вашингтоне
relation to
в отношении
Europe and
Путина,
Russia.
в отношении Европы, Раши,
That is, to
то
plan
есть,
something seriously in
чтобы
terms of
серьезно
defending
планировать
Ukraine,
кампанию
further actions, was simply
защиты Украины,
impossible.
дальнейших действий просто было невозможно.
This is the
Это
first, the
первое.
growing
Это
independence of the
постоянство
European
соответствующее
wing of NATO plus
европейского крыла
Canada
НАТО
is
плюс
favorable for
Канада
Ukraine.
благоприятно для Украины.
Yes, Ukraine is de facto
Да,
integrated, I would
Украина
say,
де-факто
into the budget
интегрируется,
and the
я бы сказал,
GDP
в
of the
бюджет
European countries of
и в
NATO.
ВПК европейских стран НАТО. Дальше.
Next, let's see what it is. Also,
То,
that is, the help
то
of
есть с
Ukraine in the
помощью Украины
financial and
финансового
military will
она
become
станет
more
более
predictable
предсказуемой.
and more reliable
Более
and calm
предсказуемой,
in this
надежной и
regard.
спокойной.
You will not sit and
Не
think,
сидеть и
oh,
думать,
the
вот
Congress of
если
the United
в данном
States, how will it
случае
vote in 2
2
months?
месяца,
And it will
а
be
будет
for the
зависеть от того,
majority
как
of those or
будет
others
после
after
ноября
November
следующего
of the
года.
following year. All this,
Вот
this ignorance, which was
это
blowing in from
неизвестность,
Washington to a
которая
significant
веяла из
extent,
Вашингтона
it
в
hindered
значительной
calm
степени,
and proper
она мешала спокойной планомерной работе.
work. Well, I must say, Trump's
Ну
behavior,
и
it somehow
надо сказать,
manifested itself at the
поведение
summit.
Трампа,
I don't know who
оно
and
как-то
how he
проявилось на
appreciated it,
самом
but I
деле.
had the
Не
impression
знаю,
that what
кто
he
как его
said, and he
оценил, а у
said
меня
it
было впечатление
indefinitely.
сложилось, что вот то, что он говорил неопределенно. Он
He
то
will say
скажет что-то
something
хорошо,
good,
что
something
может
that can be
воспринять хорошо
interpreted well for
европейцы, Европа,
Europeans, for
то
Ukraine, but
фиг
he
ему
will
с
say that it
молочком,
will
что явно
obviously be
будет
bad,
плохо,
bad for Europe, so
плохо для
Ukraine
Европы,
is
значит,
good for
Украина
Putin.
хорошо для Путина. То есть
That is, I had the
он
impression that he
посылал
sent
сигналы
signals to
Путину,
Putin that
что
don't can be good, but he can
вроде
be
бы он
offended and
хороший,
become bad.
но он может обидеться и стать плохим.
Therefore, hurry up with your
Поэтому
projects, which he
спеши
told
со
me,
своими
apparently told him
проектами.
after visiting the
Я
Kremlin in
рассказал,
Vitkov.
ему
When will it
рассказал
be?
после
How much
посещения
can you
Кремля
endure?
Уитков. Когда же оно будет?
Now, specifically, what is good? The growth of defense spending by 5%. Well, out of 5%, 3.5% is real, the rest is infrastructure. In 1935, it's also a long time, it's a very long time, but some kind of increase will happen. It's already happening. And this is strengthening the military basis of the alliance and means a significant growth of support for Ukraine through the defense industry. There are already several countries in Europe that are creating joint enterprises that will work for Ukraine. That is, joint GDP of Ukraine with the European countries of NATO. Plus, for the next year, they have already collected about $40 billion, and this is not the end. But this is real money, and I am sure that from the decisions that have been made, from the situation that has happened, from the decisions that have been made, the necessary sums will be allocated further, necessary to ensure the defense of Ukraine. Again, there will not be this nerve-wracking as it was until now with Washington. Whether it will be, whether it will not be, what Trump said, what Graham answered, and so on. Then all the same, Europe expressed, although it says not enough, well, I have the impression that it was possible at all with the most diplomatic statements to denote the attitude of Europe, that is, NATO to Russia. It does not matter, the main thing now is the case. That is, it was possible not to be angry and not to ridicule Trump with bold statements in the direction of Putin. The main thing is, after all, in the declaration, it was recorded that the generation-loved support for Ukraine was confirmed by the importance of the help of its defense industry. And now this is on the shoulders of the Allies by and large. Although the United States, despite the soft rhetoric of Trump, has not yet officially refused to supply weapons to Ukraine, which is very important for the transfer of intelligence. Based on these decisions that were made, Ukraine has the right to expect an increase in the volume of aid and stability in providing this aid. A significant increase in investment in weapons and infrastructure, which should be aimed at supporting Ukraine. Especially when it comes to the so-called European equivalent of the Patriot system and the latest developments, first of all in the field of unmanned vehicles. And this is very important. That is, there used to be complaints that the United States was supplying a technique that was already outdated, not so effective. Ukraine during the war came out, first of all, thanks to its armed forces, its engineers and scientists, to the front lines of military technology. And Ukraine led the way to a new strategy, to a new tactic, with the use of completely new technology, what the Soviet Union is. Fighting now and what it was planned to fight and they fought at the end of 1922, at the beginning of 1923, these are completely different things. The creation of joint enterprises on the territory of Europe for the production of weapons in Ukraine gives an opportunity to receive the latest developments. The de facto alliance begins to see Ukraine as an important strategic partner, although it does not promise an immediate membership. That is, it means, as analysts say, support for the partnership model without membership. Many are unfairly dissatisfied with this situation, but it should be noted that Israel has the same status in relation to the Western world. It is not a member of any alliance. It is associated with the United States with a treaty that, by and large, I once analyzed, resembles the Treaty of Strategic Cooperation between Ukraine and the United States. The same is said there that if a critical situation arises, then the two sides urgently establish contact to discuss the issue of what needs to be done and how. That is, in relation to the United States and Israel, it works, but Ukraine needs to be in practice. That is, the form, the language of the article or the treaty is the same. It just needs to be saturated with its real content, and this is the task of practical activity of Ukrainian diplomacy. That is, the example of Israel shows that it is possible to find a form of effective protection, providing for its defense even within such a form. Now, what else is important? I think Europe, in principle, is ready to take on itself more. This reduces the dependence of Europe on the United States of America. But at the same time, it increases pressure on Kiev. Now, Kiev directly with another partner has a chance to establish more close relations, more effective. And this requires more, so to speak, active activity, I would say mutually beneficial activity. The estimates differ from each other. I have read what is considered positive moments, but there are also negative estimates. The most sharp, I would say, was heard from the former deputy chief of staff of the Supreme Commander of NATO in Europe, the French general in post, Michel Yakovlev. He is a brilliant analyst. I analyzed his articles, interviews, he says everything right. So he believes that Donald Trump, as the President of the United States, betrayed Ukraine, depriving it of the necessary military and financial assistance in the name of Russia during the Russian offensive. If it were in his power, he would simply have given Ukraine to Putin on a plate. Trump clearly gives preference to Putin. In fact, this is a policy that to some extent is pro-Russian. But so far, the President of the United States does not dare to bring his logic to the end about Putin. Why is he not daring? Ratings. This is the only thing that stops him. If you look at all the evil that Trump has already done to Ukraine since his victory in November, he has already gone very far, trying to literally give Ukraine to Putin on a plate. Here is such an assessment. A similar assessment was also heard from the former deputy of the former head of the NATO command in Europe, the British general, who said that it is necessary to finally stop lying like a fool. It is necessary to decide and disperse. Either you are with us, this is how he addressed the president of Trump, or you are with us, the United States, with Europe, with NATO, or goodbye, we will be ourselves. I would say this is correct on the one hand, the position like what a fool to lie down, but I would take a more flexible position. I like a more flexible position. That is, now to define such a break is only on Putin's hand. This is then a direct, not covered by anything, turn of Trump to Moscow, to the Kremlin. He will say, I was kicked out of NATO, I was humiliated, I was insulted, and I did so much, I saved them so much. I saved the whole Cold War and they hit me in the face like this, I'm leaving. But this is nothing, by and large. Until it works and is determined, until it works on its own, completely on its own, the European wing, NATO plus Canada. And this should work both in terms of supply of conventional weapons. For this, it is necessary to launch the VPK into full swing and carry out the corresponding purchases from the United States of America. And it is necessary to develop its own structures. For now, there is a NATO command that is headed by the American General Grinkovich. This is good. This means that the United States is still there. That is, the forest in Moscow is also unknown. Who the hell knows it? You get in from the other side, you get in from the same Swahili corridor. And how did Trump get up this morning? Who knows him? And how will it all end? That is, here the uncertainty. It plays badly for both Europeans, but it can also play badly for Russia. Thus, while this whole corridor will be carried out, experts need to think about how to cover it, how to ensure security. And now, taking into account the recent events in the Middle East,
на Ближнем Востоке э,
The war that
вмешавшись в
began
войну
between Israel
между
and
Израилем
Iran,
и
taking into
Ираном,
account all the
учитывая
circumstances of
те
Iran's nuclear
обстоятельства
program and what
ядерной
they are now
программы Ирана
bringing,
и
its
к чему они сейчас
prospects.
приводят, и ее перспективы,
Europe is increasingly thinking about whether to create its
в
own.
Европе все больше задумываются о том, не создать ли собственные ядерные силы.
Nuclear power, the European wing of
Европейское,
NATO,
европейского
regardless of
крыла
the
НАТО,
United States, that
независимо от
is, to
Соединенных
completely
Штатов,
replace the nuclear
полностью заменить
umbrella.
ядерный зонтик.
You know,
Вы
there are
знаете,
two
где страны
countries, so different
разных вариантов
options are
рассматриваются.
considered there.
Макрон
Macron has
предложил
already suggested using the
использовать
French nuclear
французскую
umbrella for
для всего
NATO.
НАТО.
He even
Он
said
сказал,
that
что
he was
готов
ready to
применять
hand it over
европейское.
to other
Но он
countries.
говорил нечто подобное в 2020
But then
году,
he said
и
something
тогда это
similar in the
было
1920s, and then it
довольно
fell on
сильно
deaf
на
ears of
ухе
European
ушли
NATO partners.
партнеров европейских по НАТО.
Now it's all come
Теперь
to life.
это все отклеилось.
Macron, why can he make such proposals?
Макрон
Because
сказал,
the
может, такие
nuclear
предложения
forces of
делать, потому
France
что
are not
ядерные силы
subject
Франции,
to the
они не
command,
подходят,
are not subject to the
не
command of
поддаются
NATO.
командованию, не подчинены командованию НАТО.
British subordinates, then the
Британскому
question
подчинению.
arises, let's
Поэтому
disassemble
можно
them and
давайте
unite
тогда
them with the French nuclear
их
forces of
развернем
Britain and
и, так сказать, объединим с французскими ядерными силами Британии
make them under
и
the command of the
сделаем их
European command of NATO.
подотчетными, поставим под командованием уже европейского командования НАТО.
The next option is to create a structure
Следующий
in Europe
вариант
that will command the nuclear
создать
forces that are now
структуру
present.
в Европе, которая будет командовать ядерными силами, которые сейчас имеются.
That is,
Куда
both the French
французы,
and the British will
американцы
give
дадут
their
свои
nuclear
ядерные силы,
forces
это
there,
новое
and this new
командование
command of the
НАТО, и НАТО
strategic
будет
NATO
ими
will lead them.
руководить. И,
And
наконец,
finally, the third
третий
option
вариант
is that separate NATO
отдельные
countries will
страны
create
НАТО
their own nuclear
будут
bomb.
создавать свою атомную бомбу. Вот это уже
This is what the
разговоры
talks
пошли
went on after the
после
war, after the
войны,
beginning of the war
после начала
between
войны
Israel
между
and
Израилем
Iran.
и Ираном.
And the
Люди
prospect
шли
of
к
Iran,
тому, что
perhaps
Иран,
in a few months,
возможно,
in a year, will become a
через
nuclear
несколько
power,
месяцев,
all this has been
через
pushed
год
back.
станет ядерной державой. Все это как-то так подтолкнуло.
It is considered which countries can really
Рассматривается, какие
create
страны
nuclear
могут реально
weapons.
создать ядерное
Germany.
оружие.
Mertz already said
Германия.
something about
Там
this
шла
there.
огромная
I don't know if there
дискуссия
was a debate
междувоенная по
about
этому
it.
поводу. Не знаю, в пылу ли дебатов это все было,
But on the way
но
to turning Germany into a
защитники
nuclear power,
ядерной
there are
державы
serious
есть
historical,
серьезные
I would even say
исторические, я
psychological,
бы сказал, даже
obstacles
психологические
inspired by the experience of the
преграды,
Second World War.
навеянные опытом Второй мировой войны.
Germany is the
Германия
culprit of two
уже
world
в
wars in
мире,
Europe, but not only
не только
two
в
world
мировой,
wars in the
в мире.
world. And the owner of
И
nuclear
обладатель
weapons is,
ядерного
well, it's
оружия
hard,
это,
it's not easy to
ну,
digest.
это тяжело, не просто
The
переводить.
second country, which is
Вторая страна,
considered even more
которая
real,
считается
can
даже
become a
более
new
реальной,
nuclear
может стать
country in
новой
Europe,
ядерной
is
страной в
Poland.
Европе, это Польша.
I
Я
once
рассказывал
told you,
как-то
with reference to
спикеру
this story, they
эту
told me
историю
here in
10 лет
Washington that
тому,
when the Soviet Union
что
collapsed and
когда
Poland wanted
развалился
to
Советский
join
Союз и
NATO, they did not want to
Польша
accept
вступила
it.
в НАТО,
Then
они не
Poland
хотели
said,
принимать,
well,
потому
then
что
we will
хотелось
create our
как
nuclear
бы
weapons.
создавать свое ядерное
And they
оружие. И
accepted
ее
it. Now
приняли.
something like this
Ее
is being
приняли.
played out, or can be played out, in
Вот
relation to
нечто
Washington and
подобное
Trump.
сейчас разыгрывается или может быть разыграно в отношении Вашингтона и Трампа.
Trump fortunately gives
Трамп,
himself out for the
он
coolest,
частью
strongest,
выдает
but
себя
he
за
is the strongest of
сильнейшего.
those who are strong at this
Он
particular moment.
он сильнейший с тем, кто сильный в данный конкретный момент.
And you remember this
И вы
story about the
помните эту
chicken,
историю насчет
which in the
цыпленка,
end
который
always
в
shudders.
конце концов всегда сдрейфит.
So for the
Это
United
для
States, it has
Соединенных Штатов
always
всегда
been a
было
terrible dream to
страшным
create,
сном
even during the
создание
Cold War,
даже
to
во
create
времена
European
создания
nuclear forces
европейских
independent of
ядерных сил,
Washington.
независимых от Вашингтона.
That is, if
Если
the
уж Соединенные
United
Штаты
States paid for the
платили за
security of
обеспечение
Europe, as
безопасности
Trump is
Европы,
now
как
complaining,
жалуется,
then they wanted to keep
мы
Europe
хотим
close,
держать
so to
Европу
speak.
и в узде, так сказать. Это
It was a
был
partner, but a subordinate
партнер, но
partner, which
подчиненный
America
партнер,
used in its
который
strategic and
Америка
foreign policy
использовала в
goals
своих
against the Soviet
стратегических,
Union.
внешнеполитических целях против Советского Союза.
It was later in the
Потом так вся
1970s
эта
that
история
Germany
как
somehow
после
came out on an
Берлинского
independent
соглашения.
path, and so the
Как
Americans did
американцы
not want to
хотели
keep it under
решения контрольные,
control.
когда
When de
de
Gaulle
Gaulle
brought France out
вывел
of NATO
Францию
subordination in the
военного
military,
обеспечения НАТО,
Washington was
что
very
не было большое
dissatisfied.
удовольствие. И
The
последнее, что
last thing
нужно
that the
сейчас
United
Соединенным
States of
Штатам
America
сделать,
needs
чтобы в
now is
ядерном
for Europe
плане
to become an independent continent
Европа
in terms
стала
of nuclear
независимым
power, and
континентом,
God
и
forbid
не дай
new
бог там
nuclear
еще
powers
появились
have
новые
appeared there.
державы ядерные.
Trump once promised to
Трамп в
make the
свое время
world
обещал
completely nuclear free, in the
полностью
sense that
ядерный.
America will control
Да-да-да,
this
был в
nuclear
полемике
world.
полностью сделать мир безъядерным, в том смысле, что Америка будет контролировать этот ядерный мир.
And suddenly Europe, Poland, or Germany become nuclear powers. That is, it is a terrible dream. And perhaps for such an option that once Poland used this factor skillfully. Oh, you do not want? Then we will create, perhaps use such a factor now, in the present time. As is noted, here was a large, broad article on this issue in the Foreign FS publication. One of perhaps the most influential in the United States, a journal on foreign policy. So they say that before the last moment, before the collision of Israel and Iran, in Europe they understood the need for the question to be raised sooner or later. And it is necessary to raise the question of creating, in some new, in other states of Europe, their nuclear forces. But they were waiting for everything. No one dared to do it first. And they were waiting for everything that the North would do, excuse me, South Korea. Why South Korea? Because South Korea is not far from North Korea, a nuclear state. China, a nuclear state, and Russia, a nuclear state. That is, surrounded by 3 nuclear states and hostile dictatorial regimes against democratic South Korea. And it was assumed that it could become another new nuclear country. If it is North Korea, then it will be followed by Japan. And then, on the brink of this wave, then European countries will have the moral right to follow their example. But the last blows on Iran's nuclear facilities, and the last thing that comes out of them, and the information that proves that Iran can, and perhaps even these blows on its nuclear facilities, will enhance its decisiveness and speed up the production of nuclear weapons, lead to the idea that European countries may also have to hurry in this regard. Well, remember when I told you, evaluating the possibilities, new opportunities of Ukraine in the developing world. Do not ask, you need to develop and offer yourself. Ukraine is one of the few countries that has specialists in the field. Of nuclear energy and rocket experts, Ukraine is huge, there is nowhere to retreat, maybe it is worth. Asking the question as Poland did in the past, I don't think that Ukraine should do this on its own. But let's say that starting a dialogue on this issue with Poland, perhaps with Germany, is possible. In any case, it becomes more and more obvious that the United States will leave Europe sooner or later. If the political situation of Europe in general, the geographical location of the continent is such, then the enemy with 1/6 of the land with a Russia name, it will remain for decades, if for centuries. That's it, dear friends, let me finish this video. As usual, the words of Ukraine and the armed forces. The enemy will be defeated, the victory will be ours. To you, dear friends, endurance, courage, and firm faith in our inevitable victory. See you soon.